What if Anakin destroyed Coruscant to save Padmé? Let's explore the depths of this scenario in the video. The nightmares came every night now, more vivid than before. Anakin Skywalker jolted awake in his quarters aboard the Resolute, sweat beading on his forehead as the images burned in his mind. His mechanical hand clenched the sheets as he struggled to separate dream from reality. But these weren't the same dreams that had plagued him for weeks. This time, he saw Padmé not dying in childbirth, but standing in chains before a Republic tribunal, her face pale with fear as the verdict rang out: guilty of treason against the Republic, death by execution. The vision was so clear, so detailed, that Anakin could see the individual faces of the judges, could hear the exact words of condemnation that sealed his wife's fate. He had learned to trust these visions ever since his mother's death. The Force was warning him, showing him a future that must not come to pass. As he sat up in bed, his breathing slowly returning to normal, Anakin made a silent vow. Whatever it took, wherever this path led him, he would not lose Padmé the way he had lost Shmi Skywalker. The war had changed everything over the past 3 years. What had begun as a conflict to preserve democracy had slowly transformed the Republic into something unrecognizable. Emergency powers granted to Chancellor Palpatine had become permanent fixtures. Military tribunals had replaced civilian courts for an ever-expanding list of crimes. Surveillance networks monitored communications across thousands of worlds. And through it all, Senator Padmé Amidala had become increasingly vocal in her opposition to these changes. Anakin thought back to their last private conversation, transmitted through encrypted channels while he was fighting on the Outer Rim. Padmé had been in her apartment on Coruscant, the city lights casting shadows across her worried face. She spoke in hushed tones about senators who had mysteriously disappeared, about journalists whose investigations into military spending had been shut down, about peaceful protesters who had vanished into the expanding prison system. The Republic we're fighting to save doesn't exist anymore. Anakin, she had said, her voice breaking with emotion. We've become everything we claimed to oppose. The Chancellor's emergency powers were supposed to be temporary, but every month brings new extensions, new justifications for why democracy must wait until after the war. And when will this war end? When every system that opposes centralized control has been crushed, Anakin had tried to reassure her, to explain that the sacrifices were necessary, that once the separatists were defeated, things would return to normal. But even as he spoke the words, he could see the doubt in her eyes. She had always been wiser about politics than he was, more attuned to the subtle currents of power that flowed through the Senate. If Padmé was worried, there was good reason to be. Now, as he prepared for another day of combat operations, Anakin reflected on how their relationship had evolved during the war. Their secret marriage on Geonosis seemed like a lifetime ago, a moment of pure happiness stolen from the chaos around them. Since then, their time together had been limited to brief encounters, coded messages, and stolen hours when his duties brought him back to Coruscant. Each reunion was precious, but each departure grew more difficult. The weight of keeping their marriage secret had taken its toll on both of them. The Jedi Code forbade emotional attachments. Yet Anakin found that his love for Padmé was the one thing that kept him grounded, that reminded him what he was fighting for. When he saw the horrors of war, when he watched good soldiers die under his command, when he was forced to make impossible choices on the battlefield, the thought of coming home to her gave him strength. But lately, those thoughts had been tinged with fear. The political situation on Coruscant was becoming more dangerous for anyone who opposed the Chancellor's agenda. Padmé's speeches in the Senate had grown more passionate, more desperate, as she watched the Republic transform into something unrecognizable. She had organized relief efforts for war refugees, challenged military spending bills, and publicly questioned the expansion of executive power. All of this had made her a target. Chancellor Palpatine watched from his office as reports flooded in about Senator Amidala's latest anti-war rally. The crowds had grown larger, more defiant. She was becoming a symbol of resistance to his carefully orchestrated conflict. And symbols had a way of inspiring others. He had spent years manipulating the galaxy into this war, playing both sides to consolidate power. But now, a single senator from Naboo threatened to expose his careful work. The Chancellor's office was a study in understated power. Ancient Sith artifacts, disguised as art pieces, lined the walls, their dark energy hidden beneath layers of respectability. Palpatine stood before the massive windows that offered a panoramic view of Coruscant's endless cityscape, watching the streams of air traffic that carried the business of a galaxy at war. Soon, all of this would be under his complete control. But first, he needed to eliminate the voices of dissent. He activated his private holographic communicator. The device scrambled with encryption that would defeat even the most sophisticated Republic intelligence systems. The blue image of Commander Fox materialized before him, the clone officer's red-marked armor gleaming in the office's subdued lighting. Fox had served as the head of Coruscant's security forces for over 2 years, and his loyalty to the Chancellor was absolute. Commander Fox, it's time. Senator Amidala has committed acts of sedition against the Republic. Arrest her immediately and prepare her for trial. Palpatine's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the tone of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Yes, my lord. The charges? The clone commander's response was immediate and professional, showing no hesitation despite the gravity of what was being asked. Treason, conspiracy against the state, and inciting rebellion. Make sure the evidence is comprehensive. We cannot afford to have this case dismissed on technicalities. The trial must be swift and decisive, a clear message to anyone else who might think to oppose the war effort. Palpatine smiled coldly as he considered the documents that his agents had been preparing for months. Doctored communications, fabricated meeting records, testimony from carefully coached witnesses. The case against Padmé would be ironclad, at least on paper. Fox nodded and cut the transmission. Within hours, a full company of clone troopers was moving through Coruscant's government district toward Padmé's apartment. The operation had been planned with military precision, timed to occur during the early morning hours, when fewer civilians would be present to witness the arrest. The Chancellor's propaganda machine was already prepared to spin the story, portraying the arrest as a necessary action to protect Republic security. The 500 and Honest Legion's barracks were buzzing with activity as Rex received his orders for the Amidala operation. The clone captain had served under Anakin Skywalker since the beginning of the war and had developed a deep respect for both the young Jedi and the senator from Naboo. Rex had seen how Senator Amidala treated clone troopers not as disposable weapons, but as individuals deserving of respect and consideration. Her advocacy for clone rights in the Senate had made her popular among the rank and file. Now he was being ordered to arrest her as a traitor. The irony was not lost on him. Captain Fox had said during the briefing, "This operation is classified at the highest level. Senator Amidala has been deemed a threat to Republic security. The evidence against her is substantial, but we cannot allow personal feelings to interfere with our duty." Rex had nodded and accepted the assignment, but privately, he struggled with the implications. The arrest was swift and brutal. Padmé barely had time to send a single encrypted message before the doors to her apartment burst open. She had been in her private study, reviewing reports from the latest Senate committee hearing on military expenditures, when the sound of marching feet echoed through the corridor outside. Her security detail, loyal guards who had served her family for years, were quickly overwhelmed by the superior firepower and training of the clone troopers. "Senator Amidala, you're under arrest for crimes against the Republic." Rex announced the charges with formal precision, but Padmé could see the conflict in his eyes behind his helmet's visor. "The charges? This is outrageous. I've done nothing but speak the truth about this war." Her voice carried the authority of her office and the indignation of innocence. But she knew that neither would protect her from what was coming. "That's exactly the problem, ma'am." Rex hesitated as he placed the energy binders on her wrists, clearly uncomfortable with the order, but duty compelled him forward. The binders hummed with contained energy, designed to prevent any attempt at escape. As they escorted her from the apartment, Padmé caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror by the door. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the circumstances, but her spirit remained unbroken. The media presence outside the apartment building was overwhelming. Reporters from across the galaxy had somehow learned of the arrest within minutes, their cameras and recording devices capturing every moment as Padmé was led to the waiting transport. The questions came in a torrent. "Senator, are the charges true? Do you have any response to allegations of treason? Will you be seeking legal representation?" Padmé walked through the crowd with dignity intact, refusing to give them the spectacle they craved. Across the galaxy, on the battle-scarred world of Megiddo, Anakin received the message just as he was leading an assault on a separatist stronghold. The encrypted transmission crackled through his personal comm, barely audible over the sound of blaster fire and explosions. The voice that came through was Padmé's, but distorted by fear and desperation. "Anakin, they've taken me. I don't know what's going to happen, but I need you to know that I love you. Don't do anything rash. Promise me." The world seemed to stop around him as the words sank in. His lightsaber trembled in his grip as rage and fear warred within him. The separatist battle droids that had been advancing on his position suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the crisis unfolding on Coruscant. His men continued to fight around him, following his last orders. But Anakin's mind was thousands of light years away. "General, are you all right?" Rex's voice came through the comm, noting Anakin's sudden stillness. The clone captain was fighting from a different position, coordinating the assault on the droid factory, but he had noticed his general's distraction. "We need to get back to Coruscant now." Anakin's voice carried an edge that his men had rarely heard, a tone that spoke of barely controlled violence. "But sir, the mission isn't complete. We're on the verge of breaking through their defenses. If we withdraw now, the Separatists will rebuild their position and will have to start over. Rex tried to reason with his general, but he could sense that something significant had happened. I said, "Now, Rex, the mission can wait." His voice carried an edge that made the clone captain step back. The Separatist forces would have to wait. Someone more important needed him. The journey to Coruscant felt like an eternity. Anakin paced the bridge of his Star Destroyer, the Resolute, reaching out through the Force to feel for Padmé's presence. She was alive, but he could sense her fear, her desperation, the crushing weight of injustice that pressed down on her spirit. The closer they got to the capital, the more his anger grew. How dare they arrest her? She had done nothing but speak truth to power. And this was how the Republic repaid her loyalty. As the familiar blue-white glow of hyperspace surrounded the ship, Anakin thought about the early days of their relationship. He remembered their first meeting on Tatooine, when she was disguised as a handmaiden and he was just a boy dreaming of freedom. He remembered their reunion on Naboo, when the awkward child had become a confident young man, and the Queen had become a senator. He remembered their first kiss in the fields outside Theed, when the war seemed far away, and their future stretched out before them like an endless sky. Now that future was threatened by forces beyond their control. The Republic they had both served faithfully was turning against them, labeling Padmé a traitor for the crime of maintaining her principles. Anakin's hands clenched into fists as he considered what he would do if the worst came to pass. The Jedi Code spoke of accepting loss, of letting go of attachment. But Anakin had never been good at following the Jedi Code. Upon arrival at Coruscant, Anakin didn't even wait for the docking procedures to be completed. He took a shuttle directly to the Jedi Temple, hoping that the Council might have some solution, some way to intervene in what was clearly a politically motivated prosecution. The temple's soaring spires and ancient architecture had always given him a sense of peace. But now the building seemed cold and distant, a monument to rules and traditions that offered no comfort in his hour of need. The council chamber was in session when Anakin burst through the doors, his robes still bearing the dust and scorch marks of battle. "Masters, I need your help. Senator Amidala has been arrested on false charges. We have to do something." His voice echoed in the circular chamber, bouncing off the walls lined with the seats of the Jedi Masters. Most of the seats were empty, their occupants fighting in distant wars. But those present turned to face him with expressions of concern and caution. Mace Windu's expression remained impassive as he responded. "We are aware of the situation, Skywalker. However, the Jedi cannot interfere with Republic justice." The Master of the Order spoke with the authority of centuries of tradition, but his words felt like a betrayal to Anakin. Even when that justice is corrupt? Even when innocent people are being railroaded? The young Jedi's voice rose with emotion, his control slipping in the face of institutional indifference. "The law is the law, Anakin. We cannot pick and choose which laws to follow based on our personal feelings. If we begin to override the Republic's legal system, we become no better than the separatists we fight against." Windu's reasoning was logical, principled, and utterly infuriating to a man whose wife faced execution for speaking the truth. Yoda leaned forward on his cane, his ancient eyes studying Anakin carefully. The Grand Master had lived through centuries of conflict and political upheaval, and his perspective carried the weight of experience. "Troubled you are, but interfere with the courts. The Jedi cannot. lead to the dark side. Such actions would. See past your attachment. You must to the greater good. The dark side? What about justice? What about doing what's right? Anakin's voice cracked with emotion as he struggled to understand how the wisest beings in the galaxy could sit by and do nothing while an innocent woman faced death. Feel your anger. I do. Dangerous it island. Release your attachment. You must, Yoda replied, his voice gentle but firm. Learn to let go of what you fear to lose. You must. Attachment? She's an innocent woman being persecuted for speaking the truth. How is caring about that attachment? Anakin's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the force rippling around him in response to his emotional turmoil. The other masters in the chamber shifted uncomfortably. Sensing the young knight's growing instability, Kit Fisto leaned forward in his seat, his expression compassionate but resolute. Anakin, we understand your pain. Senator Amidala is a good woman who has served the Republic with honor. But if we intervene in her trial, we risk destroying the very system we've sworn to protect. The Jedi cannot become kingmakers, deciding which laws apply and which do not. What system? Anakin shot back, his voice filled with bitter irony. A system that arrests its greatest advocates for democracy? A system that grants unlimited power to one man while silencing dissent? When did protecting that system become more important than protecting the innocent? The debate continued for nearly an hour, with Anakin growing more frustrated, and the Council growing more concerned about his emotional state. Finally, Master Shak Ti spoke up from her position near the window. Perhaps, young Skywalker, you should consider that your feelings for Senator Amidala are clouding your judgment. The Force will guide us to the right path, but only if we remain detached from personal desires. Frustrated and feeling betrayed by his own order, Anakin left the temple and made his way to the Senate building. Perhaps there was still hope through legal channels, through political pressure from Padmé's allies in the Senate. The massive structure that housed the Republic's government seemed even more imposing than usual. Its countless platforms and meeting chambers buzzing with activity as senators debated the fate of their colleague, but what he found there crushed his remaining optimism. The trial was a mockery, a predetermined farce designed to send a message to anyone who dared oppose the war effort. Anakin watched from the public gallery as the prosecution presented their case, each piece of evidence more damning and more obviously fabricated than the last. The documents they displayed showed meeting schedules that placed Padmé in locations she had never visited, communications with separatist agents she had never met, financial transactions that had never occurred. The prosecuting attorney, a stern-faced man named Wilhuff Tarkin, who served as the Chancellor's personal representative, presented each piece of evidence with theatrical flourish. Senator Amidala's pattern of seditious behavior is clear and undeniable, he declared to the tribunal. Her public statements have consistently undermined military morale and given aid and comfort to our enemies. Her private communications show a clear intent to collaborate with separatist forces for the purpose of overthrowing the legitimate government of the Republic. Padmé's defense attorney, a nervous young man who had been assigned to the case at the last minute, did his best to challenge the evidence. But it was clear that the outcome had been predetermined. Every objection was overruled. Every request for additional time to examine evidence was denied. Every attempt to call character witnesses was blocked on procedural grounds. Padmé sat in the defendant's chair throughout the proceedings, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. When she was finally allowed to speak in her own defense, her words rang with truth and conviction, echoing through the chamber with the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to public service. I stand accused of treason for opposing a war that has cost us our democracy, our freedoms, and our souls. If speaking out against the militarization of our republic is treason, then I am guilty. But I would rather be guilty of caring about our people than complicit in their oppression. Her voice never wavered as she spoke. Even though she knew her words would not save her, she continued, addressing not just the tribunal but the galaxy that was watching through the broadcast feeds. I have served this republic for 15 years, first as Queen of Naboo, and then as a senator. I have seen it evolve from a beacon of hope and democracy into something I no longer recognize. We have traded our freedoms for the promise of security, and in doing so, we have achieved neither. The war that was supposed to preserve our way of life has instead destroyed it from within. The tribunal deliberated for mere minutes before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all charges. The sentence, death by execution, to be carried out within 3 days. The gallery erupted in outrage from Padmé's supporters, but the clone troopers quickly restored order with stun weapons and physical force. Anakin watched in horror from the viewing area, his world crumbling around him as the woman he loved was condemned to die for the crime of maintaining her principles. That evening, Chancellor Palpatine requested a private meeting with Anakin in his office. The young Jedi arrived at the appointed time, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. The Chancellor's office seemed different somehow, darker and more oppressive than Anakin remembered. The ancient artifacts that decorated the walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the city lights outside the windows cast eerie shadows across the room. I'm sorry about Senator Amidala, Anakin. I tried to intervene, but the tribunal's decision is final. The military has insisted that examples must be made of those who undermine the war effort. Palpatine spoke with apparent sympathy, but Anakin could sense something else beneath the surface, a satisfaction that the Chancellor was trying to hide. This is your republic, Chancellor, your emergency powers. Surely you can do something. The plea in Anakin's voice was unmistakable. The desperation of a man watching his world collapse around him. I'm afraid it's not that simple. The hardliners in the Senate are watching my every move. If I show favoritism to one senator, it could undermine everything we've worked for. The delicate balance of power that maintains our war effort could be destroyed, but there might be another way. Palpatine moved to the window, gazing out at the city planet below, with the expression of a man contemplating difficult choices. The problem isn't just the tribunal, Anakin. It's the entire power structure that created it. Senator Bail Organa, Admiral Tarkin, Senator Ark, dozens of others. They're all part of a network that sees people like Padmé as threats to their vision of order. Even if I pardoned her, they'd find another way to silence her. What are you suggesting? Anakin asked, though part of him already knew where this conversation was leading. Sometimes, my boy, change requires dramatic action. When a system is too corrupt to reform, it must be replaced entirely. The Chancellor's voice carried a note of reluctant necessity, as if he were proposing something distasteful but unavoidable. Anakin stared at the Chancellor, understanding the implication but not quite believing it. You're talking about eliminating the Senate leadership. I'm talking about saving the woman you love and creating a better galaxy in the process. Think about it, Anakin. How many systems would be better off without these warmongers pulling the strings? How many lives could be saved if we removed those who profit from suffering? The idea was monstrous, but as Anakin thought about Padmé dying for the crime of speaking truth, it began to seem less impossible. But how? Even if I could somehow target them all, they're spread across the planet, protected by layers of security. Individual assassinations would take months and would certainly be discovered before completion. Actually, Palpatine said with a slight smile, there's a simpler solution. Coruscant's power grid is more centralized than most people realize. The entire planet runs on energy from 3 massive fusion reactors deep beneath the surface. Each reactor is capable of powering a third of the planet's systems, but they're also interconnected in ways that most people don't understand. If someone with the right technical knowledge were to cause a cascade failure in one reactor, the resulting energy feedback would overload the other 2 within minutes. You're talking about destroying the entire planet. Millions of innocent lives. Anakin's voice was barely a whisper, as the scope of what Palpatine was suggesting became clear. Billions, actually. But consider this. Those billions live under the thumb of a corrupt system that will never change. Many of them support the very policies that condemned Padmé. And think of all the systems that would be freed from Republic control. All the species that could govern themselves, instead of being exploited by Coruscant's bureaucrats. The Chancellor continued his argument, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that seemed to bypass Anakin's conscious mind and speak directly to his emotions. The Republic is already dead. Anakin, it died the moment we allowed fear to triumph over freedom. What we have now is a military dictatorship masquerading as democracy. By destroying its center of power, we would be performing a mercy killing, ending its suffering and allowing something better to take its place. Anakin's mind reeled at the scope of what Palpatine was suggesting. There has to be another way. What if I broke her out instead? Tried a rescue mission? The young Jedi grasped for alternatives, but even as he spoke, he could see the flaws in his own suggestions. You could try, but where would you go? Every system in the Republic would be hunting you. And even if you escaped, Padmé would spend the rest of her life as a fugitive, always looking over her shoulder. Is that the life you want for her? For your children? The mention of children hit Anakin like a physical blow. He had seen them in his dreams, Luke and Leia, growing up free and happy, in a galaxy where justice and democracy meant something. How could they have that future if their mother was executed as a traitor? How could he look them in the eyes and explain that he had chosen principles over their mother's life? Palpatine seemed to sense his internal struggle and pressed his advantage. I know this is difficult, Anakin. I know it goes against everything the Jedi have taught you. But sometimes, the greater good requires sacrifices that seem unthinkable. The Jedi Council would have you accept Padmé's death as the will of the Force, but I say that the Force works through us, through our choices and our actions. If you have the power to save her, don't you have the responsibility to use it? The night before the execution, Anakin managed to gain access to the detention center, where Padmé was being held. The facility was a fortress of reinforced durasteel and energy barriers, designed to hold the Republic's most dangerous criminals. But Anakin's reputation as a war hero and his status as a Jedi Knight gave him access that others would be denied. The guards who escorted him through the corridors treated him with a mixture of respect and caution, clearly uncomfortable with the circumstances but unwilling to refuse a direct request from a general. Padmé's cell was sparse and sterile, containing only a narrow bed, a basic refresher unit, and a small table. She looked tired but unbroken, her spirit still shining despite everything they had put her through. When she saw Anakin approaching through the energy barrier, her face lit up with a mixture of relief and concern. "I knew you'd come," she said softly as he approached the barrier that separated them. The energy field hummed with contained power, a constant reminder of her captivity. "I'm going to get you out of this, I promise." His voice carried absolute conviction, the certainty of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through determination and skill. "Anakin, no. Whatever you're thinking, don't do it. I can see it in your eyes. You're planning something terrible." She moved closer to the barrier, her eyes pleading with him to reconsider whatever course of action he was contemplating. "If you love me, you won't sacrifice your soul to save my life. There are some prices too high to pay, even for love. What good is my soul if you're dead? What's the point of being righteous if the people I love suffer for it?" The words poured out of him with passionate intensity, years of frustration and anger finally finding voice. The Jedi talk about letting go, about accepting fate, but I can't. I won't. I lost my mother because I was too weak to save her. I won't make the same mistake with you. There's always another way, Anakin. We could run, disappear to the outer rim. I'd rather live as a fugitive with you than see you become something you're not. But even as she spoke, they both knew it was impossible. The Republic's reach was too long, their resources too vast. There would be no hiding, no peace, only a life of constant fear and the knowledge that eventually they would be found. They talked through the night, their conversation ranging from memories of happier times to fears about the future. Padmé spoke about the children she carried, about her hopes for the kind of galaxy they would inherit. Anakin listened to every word, memorizing the sound of her voice, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about their future together. As dawn approached and the time for her execution drew near, their conversation took on a desperate quality, as if they could somehow delay the inevitable by refusing to say goodbye. The execution was scheduled for noon, to be broadcast across the galaxy as a warning to anyone who might think to oppose the war effort. As Padmé was led from her cell toward the execution chamber, Anakin made his choice. He had spent the remainder of the night studying the reactor schematics that Palpatine had provided, memorizing every detail of Coruscant's power infrastructure. The security was tight, but not impossible for a Jedi to bypass. The technical modifications required were within his skill set, and the Force would guide him where knowledge failed. He infiltrated the lower levels of Coruscant during the execution proceedings, when most of the security forces were focused on crowd control above. The reactor facility was located nearly a kilometer beneath the planet's surface, accessible only through a series of heavily guarded maintenance tunnels and service elevators. The complex was a marvel of engineering, containing enough power to fuel the dreams and ambitions of an entire galaxy. The three primary reactors were massive structures, each one the size of a small city and surrounded by layers of shielding and safety systems. The fusion reactions they contained burned at temperatures that rivaled the cores of stars, held in check by magnetic fields and containment systems that represented the pinnacle of Republic technology. Under normal circumstances, the reactors were virtually foolproof, protected by redundant safety systems and monitored by sophisticated computer networks. But Anakin was not planning a normal circumstance. The reactor facility was a maze of corridors and access shafts, humming with barely contained energy. The very air seemed to vibrate with power, and the constant background noise of cooling systems and energy conduits created an almost hypnotic atmosphere. Anakin moved like a shadow through this mechanical labyrinth, using the Force to sense approaching guards and avoid detection. The facility's security was provided by a combination of clone troopers and automated systems. Most of the guards were stationed at obvious choke points and entrances, following standard protocols that assumed any threat would come from outside. They were not prepared for an infiltrator who already had legitimate access to many areas of the complex and who possessed abilities that their training had not prepared them to counter. Anakin's first objective was the central control room, where the primary safety systems could be accessed and modified. The room was located at the heart of the complex, surrounded by layers of security and monitoring equipment. Getting there required him to bypass several checkpoints, but his reputation and Jedi status provided him with access that others would be denied. The control room itself was a testament to Republic engineering, filled with displays and control panels that monitored every aspect of the reactor's operation. Holographic displays showed the status of containment fields, fusion reaction rates, and power distribution networks. The systems were so sophisticated that they could detect and correct problems faster than any human operator could respond, automatically adjusting parameters to maintain perfect balance. But every system had vulnerabilities, and Anakin had spent hours studying the technical manuals that Palpatine had provided. He knew exactly which safeguards to disable, which feedback loops to interrupt, which containment protocols to override. As he worked, inserting carefully crafted computer viruses and making subtle modifications to safety systems, part of his mind remained focused on the execution above. He could feel Padmé's terror through the Force, her despair as the final preparations were made. The modifications he was making would not take effect immediately. Instead, they would create a cascade of small failures that would build over time, each one triggering the next in a carefully orchestrated sequence. By the time the facility's automated systems detected the problems, it would be too late to stop the chain reaction. The containment fields would fail in a specific sequence, causing the fusion reactions to become unstable and eventually breach their magnetic bottles. A security patrol discovered his work before he could finish the final modifications. Intruder in Reactor, Section 7. Armed and dangerous. The alert echoed through the facility's communication system as clone troopers poured into the control room. Anakin's lightsaber blazed to life as he prepared to defend his work, its blue glow reflecting off the polished surfaces of the control panels around him. He didn't want to kill the guards. They were just following orders, doing their duty as they understood it. But they stood between him and saving Padmé, and that made them obstacles to be removed. His blade moved in deadly arcs, deflecting blaster fire and striking down anyone who tried to stop him. The confined space of the control room worked to his advantage, limiting the number of opponents who could engage him at once. General Skywalker? One of the clone sergeants hesitated in recognition, his blaster wavering as he realized who he was fighting. "Sir, what are you doing here?" The confusion in the clone's voice was evident even through his helmet's voice modulator. "Saving someone who matters more than any of us," Anakin replied, his lightsaber never stopping its deadly dance. The clone's momentary hesitation was enough for Anakin to finish his work. The reactor's containment field began to fluctuate as the modified systems started their deadly countdown. Warning lights flashed throughout the control room as automated systems detected the anomalies and attempted to compensate. But the damage was already done. The cascade failure had begun. As alarms blared throughout the facility, Anakin raced toward the surface. He had perhaps 20 minutes before the cascade failure would reach critical mass, before the planet's crust would crack and the surface would be consumed in nuclear fire. Behind him, emergency crews rushed to contain the growing crisis, but their efforts were doomed to failure. The modifications Anakin had made were too subtle, too carefully designed to be easily reversed. He had to reach Padmé before then, had to get her off-world before his terrible choice claimed them both. The journey from the reactor complex to the execution chamber normally took 15 minutes by high-speed transport, but the city's traffic systems were already beginning to fail as power fluctuations spread through the grid. Anakin commandeered a military speeder and raced through the urban canyons of Coruscant, weaving between buildings and air traffic with reckless abandon. The execution chamber was located in the Senate's judicial complex, a building designed to project the Republic's commitment to law and order. The chamber itself was a circular room with seating for hundreds of observers, designed to accommodate the media coverage that would broadcast the proceedings across the galaxy. As Anakin approached the building, he could see the crowds of protesters who had gathered outside, some supporting Padmé and others calling for her death. The building's security was provided by the Coruscant Guard, elite clone troopers who served as the capital's police force. They had established a perimeter around the complex, using crowd control barriers and stun weapons to keep the protesters at a safe distance. Getting through their lines would require a frontal assault that would certainly result in casualties among both the guards and the civilian protesters. But Anakin was beyond caring about subtlety now. The execution chamber was in chaos as he burst through the doors, his lightsaber cutting through security barriers like they were made of paper. Clone troopers raised their weapons, but he was beyond their ability to stop. The Force flowed through him like a river of power as he carved through their ranks, his lightsaber a blur of blue death. The executioner's platform exploded as he brought the ceiling down on the guards below, his control over the Force allowing him to direct the falling debris with surgical precision. Emergency lighting flickered on as the building's power systems began to fail, adding to the chaos and confusion. Through it all, Anakin moved with single-minded purpose toward the execution platform, where Padmé waited. Padmé watched in horror as the man she loved became something monstrous before her eyes. His face was twisted with rage and desperation, his movements precise and deadly as he cut down anyone who stood between them. This wasn't the gentle, passionate man she had married in secret on Geonosis. This was something else, something that frightened her, even as it fought to save her life. "Anakin, what have you done?" she gasped as he freed her from the restraints that held her to the execution chair. "What was necessary?" he replied, his voice carrying an edge she had never heard before. "We have to go. Now." The platform shook beneath their feet as the first shock waves from the reactor failure reached them. Across the city, power grids began to fail as the planetary energy system collapsed. "What's happening?" Padmé asked as they ran through corridors filled with panicking officials and confused guards. The building shook more violently with each passing moment, and the lights flickered ominously. Anakin's stolen shuttle waited on a nearby landing platform, its engines already warming as automated systems prepared for departure. Emergency broadcasts echoed through the hallways as they made their escape. Critical system failure detected in primary reactor complex. Evacuation procedures are now in effect. All citizens report to designated emergency shelters immediately. But even as the announcements played, everyone involved knew that there would be no shelters that could protect them from what was coming. The shuttle's engines roared to life as they cleared the landing platform, carrying them up through Coruscant's endless layers of traffic and atmosphere. As they climbed towards space, Anakin watched through the viewport as his actions bore their terrible fruit. The planet's crust began to crack like an eggshell as uncontrolled fusion reactions spread from the reactor cores. Cities that had stood for millennia were consumed in seconds as nuclear fire spread across continents. The destruction was both beautiful and horrifying to behold. Coruscant had been the shining center of galactic civilization for over 1,000 years. Its towering spires and endless urban landscape, a symbol of progress and unity. Now, all of that was being erased in a display of raw power that could be seen from orbit. The Jedi Temple, symbol of 1,000 generations of peacekeepers, vanished in a pillar of flame that reached into the atmosphere. The ancient structure had weathered wars and political upheavals, but it could not survive the nuclear fire that now consumed everything in its path. With it died the archives that contained millennia of accumulated wisdom, the training grounds where generations of Jedi had learned to use the Force, and the sacred spaces where the Order had communed with the light side. The Senate building, where Padmé had fought so hard for justice and democracy, melted like wax in the inferno. The great rotunda where representatives from across the galaxy had debated the future of their civilization became a crater of molten metal and stone. The countless offices and meeting chambers where the business of a republic had been conducted for centuries were reduced to their component atoms in moments. But it was not just the symbols of power that perished in the flames. Trillions of beings, innocent and guilty alike, died in moments as their world became a miniature star. Families were vaporized in their homes. Children were consumed in their schools. Workers were incinerated at their posts. The vast majority of those who died had never heard of Padmé Amidala, never participated in the political machinations that had condemned her, never done anything more than try to live their lives in peace. From space, Coruscant looked like a burning ember, beautiful and terrible in its destruction. The planet that had been the beating heart of galactic civilization was now a ball of fire and molten rock, its surface temperature hot enough to melt durasteel. The orbital habitats and space stations that had surrounded the planet were caught in the expanding wave of destruction, their structures crushed by the shockwaves and their populations vaporized by the intense radiation. Padmé stared at the devastation in shocked silence, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "All those people," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the shuttle's engines. "Anakin, all those people are dead. They were going to kill you," he replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "I couldn't let that happen, so you killed them instead. You killed everyone?" Her voice rose to near hysteria as the full scope of what he had done began to sink in. The children, the families, people who had nothing to do with my trial. How could you? They were part of the system that condemned you. They supported it with their silence, benefited from it with their comfort. Their deaths will serve as a warning to anyone else who thinks they can crush the innocent under the weight of their corruption. I saved you. That's all that matters. We can start over now. Build something better. Better? She pulled away from him, horror replacing the love in her eyes. You've committed genocide. Anakin, you've become exactly what we were fighting against. No, I became what I needed to become to protect what matters most. The strength in his voice could not hide the uncertainty beneath it. The growing realization that his victory had come at a price he had not fully considered. Across the galaxy, the destruction of Coruscant sent shockwaves through every system. The Republic's government was gone, its military leadership vaporized, its bureaucracy reduced to atoms. Communication networks that had connected thousands of worlds suddenly went silent as their central hub disappeared in nuclear fire. Trade routes that had operated for millennia were disrupted as their regulatory framework ceased to exist. On some worlds, the news was met with celebration. Systems that had chafed under Republic rule saw an opportunity for independence, a chance to govern themselves without interference from distant bureaucrats. Separatist worlds that had been fighting for autonomy suddenly found themselves victorious by default. Their enemy's capital reduced to radioactive slag. But on other worlds, the reaction was one of horror and disbelief. Coruscant had been more than just a seat of government. It had been a symbol of unity, a proof that different species could work together for the common good. Its destruction represented not just a military victory, but the death of an ideal that had sustained galactic civilization for over a millennium. The immediate chaos was overwhelming. Without a central government, trade disputes escalated into armed conflicts. Border disagreements became full-scale wars as systems settled old grudges without fear of Republic intervention. Pirates and raiders emerged from hiding to prey on shipping lanes that were no longer protected by Republic patrols. Some systems attempted to maintain order by forming regional alliances, but these efforts were hampered by mutual suspicion and competing interests. The carefully balanced trade agreements that had kept the galaxy's economy functioning began to collapse as systems imposed their own tariffs and restrictions. Currency exchange rates fluctuated wildly as confidence in Republic credits evaporated along with the government that had backed them. The Separatists, led by Count Dooku, attempted to capitalize on the power vacuum left by Coruscant's destruction. They launched coordinated attacks on key systems, hoping to expand their territory while their enemies were still reeling from the shock of losing their capital. But their advances were met with fierce resistance from local defense forces and hastily formed militias. Many systems that had remained neutral during the Clone Wars now found themselves forced to choose sides. But the choice was no longer between the Republic and the Separatists. Instead, it was between order and chaos, between civilization and anarchy. Some worlds threw their support behind the Separatists as the only organized force capable of maintaining stability, while others formed their own coalitions to resist any attempt at conquest. On Polis Massa, Obi-Wan Kenobi felt the disturbance in the Force as billions of voices cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. The sensation was overwhelming, a psychic scream that seemed to echo through every fiber of his being. He had felt similar disturbances during major battles, but nothing on this scale. It was as if the Force itself was wounded by the magnitude of the loss. He knew, with the certainty that only the Force could provide, that his former Padawan was responsible. The tracking beacon hidden in Anakin's ship led him on a hunt across the Outer Rim, following the trail of a man who had traded his soul for love. But this was not the Anakin he had trained, not the young man he had come to see as a brother. This was something else, something that had emerged from the ashes of good intentions and passionate love. The investigation took weeks, as Obi-Wan pieced together the evidence of what had happened on Coruscant. Republic intelligence networks had been severely disrupted by the planet's destruction, but enough data survived in remote archives to paint a picture of the events leading up to the catastrophe. Security recordings from the reactor facility showed Anakin's infiltration and the modifications he had made to the safety systems. But it was more than just evidence that guided Obi-Wan's understanding. Through the Force, he could sense the emotional turmoil that had driven his former apprentice to such desperate action. The fear of loss, the rage at injustice, the desperate love that had consumed all other considerations. These were feelings that Obi-Wan understood, having struggled with similar emotions throughout his own life. Yoda, ancient and wise, meditated on Dagobah as the galaxy burned around them. The Grand Master had foreseen many possible futures through his connection to the Force, but none of his visions had prepared him for this. The Chosen One, meant to bring balance to the Force, had instead brought catastrophe beyond imagination. In trying to save one life, Anakin had destroyed billions. Failed, the Jedi had. Yoda realized with profound sadness. Failed to see the darkness growing in one they trusted. Failed to guide him away from the path of destruction. Failed to understand that balance sometimes required accepting loss. The order that had guided the galaxy for 1,000 years was now scattered and broken, its members dead or in hiding, its reputation forever tainted by association with the man who had destroyed Coruscant. The ancient Jedi wondered if this was indeed the balance that the prophecies had foretold. Perhaps the Force required such extremes, such dramatic shifts between light and dark, order and chaos. Perhaps Anakin's actions, horrific as they were, served some greater purpose that was beyond mortal understanding. But such philosophical considerations offered little comfort in the face of such devastating loss. Anakin and Padmé fled to Tatooine, to the desert world where his journey had begun. The choice was both practical and symbolic. The remote planet was far from the major hyperspace routes that connected the core worlds, making it unlikely that they would be found quickly. But it was also the place where Anakin had first experienced loss, where his mother had died in his arms, and he had tasted the dark side for the first time. The Lars moisture farm provided them with shelter, but there was no peace to be found in the familiar landscape. Owen and Beru Lars took them in reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with harboring fugitives, but unwilling to turn away family. The farm's isolation, which had once seemed like a curse to young Anakin, now felt like a blessing to the man who had destroyed a world. But even in this remote sanctuary, there was no escape from what he had done. Padmé grew more distant with each passing day, the weight of his actions standing between them like an impassable chasm. She still carried their children, but the joy of impending parenthood was poisoned by the knowledge of how their father had saved them. She would catch herself looking at Anakin sometimes, trying to see the man she had loved in the stranger who shared his face. The twins were born on Tatooine, delivered by a medical droid that Owen had acquired from a passing trader. Luke and Leia came into a galaxy very different from the one their parents had dreamed of, a universe without the Republic that had been their mother's life's work, or the Jedi Order that had been their father's calling. They were beautiful children, healthy and strong, but their birth was overshadowed by the circumstances that had brought them into existence. Padmé held her children and wept, not from joy but from sorrow for the world they would inherit. These babies would grow up knowing that their father had committed genocide to ensure their mother's survival. How could she explain that to them? How could she help them understand the difference between love and obsession, between protection and destruction? "You don't understand," Anakin pleaded during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "I did this for us, for our family. I did this so our children could grow up free, without the Republic's corruption poisoning their future. Our children will grow up knowing their father is a mass murderer. How is that freedom?" Padmé's response was filled with a pain that cut deeper than any lightsaber wound. The debates between them grew more heated as the weeks passed. Anakin tried to justify his actions by pointing to the chaos that had followed Coruscant's destruction, arguing that systems were finally free to govern themselves without interference from corrupt bureaucrats. He spoke of the end of the Clone War, the dissolution of the military-industrial complex that had profited from conflict, the opportunity for a new form of government to emerge. But Padmé saw only the cost of these changes. She monitored the news feeds that reached even Tatooine, watching as system after system descended into violence. Trade wars became shooting wars as planets fought for resources that had once been distributed by Republic agencies. Refugee crises developed as populations fled from conflicts that were no longer contained by peacekeeping forces. "The children," she would say, holding Luke and Leia close to her chest. "Think about all the children who died because of what you did. They had families too, parents who loved them just as much as we love ours. What gave you the right to decide that our family was more important than theirs?" Anakin had no answer that satisfied either of them. He had acted from love, from desperation, from a refusal to accept loss that had been ingrained in him since childhood. But love alone could not justify genocide, and desperation could not resurrect the dead. The man who had once been the hero of the Republic now found himself trapped in a prison of his own making, surrounded by the consequences of choices that could never be undone. The confrontation came at last in the wastes of Tatooine, far from any settlement where their battle might endanger innocent lives. Obi-Wan had tracked them down through a combination of Republic intelligence reports and Force-guided intuition, following a trail that led inevitably to the desert world where everything had begun. His ship landed at dawn, its engines stirring the sand into spiraling clouds that danced in the twin suns' light. Padmé stood between the two men she loved most in the galaxy, her heart breaking as she realized what was about to happen. "You don't have to do this, Obi-Wan. He's still the man you trained, still your friend." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were no longer true. The man she had married had died somewhere in the reactor complex beneath Coruscant, replaced by this stranger who wore his face. No, he's not. Obi-Wan's lightsaber ignited with its familiar snap hiss, the blue blade humming in the desert air. "The man I trained would never have committed genocide. The man I called brother would never have valued one life over billions. This thing wearing Anakin's face is something else entirely, something that must be stopped before it destroys what little remains of the galaxy." Anakin's red-bladed lightsaber blazed to life in response, the crystal within it corrupted by his fall to the dark side. The weapon had once been blue, a symbol of his connection to the Jedi Order and his commitment to justice. But the events on Coruscant had changed more than just the crystal's color. They had transformed the man who wielded it into something unrecognizable. "I did what needed to be done," Anakin declared, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had convinced himself that his actions were justified. "I saved the woman I love and freed the galaxy from tyranny. If that makes me a monster, then so be it." The Republic was already dead, killed by corruption and greed. "I simply put it out of its misery." "You saved no one, Anakin. You've condemned the galaxy to chaos and warfare. Systems are already turning on each other, believing that any of them could be the next Coruscant. You've created the very darkness you claimed to be fighting against." Obi-Wan's words carried the weight of observation, based on reports he had received from across the galaxy during his hunt for his former apprentice. "That is where you are mistaken. The chaos is temporary, a necessary transition period as the galaxy learns to govern itself without the Republic's interference. In time, new alliances will form, new governments will emerge, and peace will be restored. But it will be a true peace, based on freedom rather than oppression." "And how many more will die during this transition period? How many worlds will burn while you wait for your new order to emerge?" Obi-Wan's voice carried a sadness that came from watching his greatest student become his greatest failure. The Anakin I knew would never have been willing to pay such a price for his own happiness. Their battle was fierce but brief. Both men were skilled warriors, masters of lightsaber combat, who had fought side by side through countless battles during the Clone Wars. But the years of fighting together had taught each of them the other's strengths and weaknesses, creating a deadly symmetry in their conflict. Anakin fought with the desperate fury of a man defending his choices, his blade moving in patterns that spoke of rage and pain rather than discipline and control. The dark side flowed through him like poison, giving him strength but also clouding his judgment. His attacks were powerful but reckless, driven by emotion rather than strategy. Obi-Wan fought with the controlled precision of a Jedi Master, his defensive style perfectly suited to containing his opponent's aggression. He had studied Anakin's fighting style for years, knew every technique and tendency, every strength and weakness. More importantly, he fought from a position of emotional stability, unencumbered by the guilt and rage that drove his former apprentice. The duel took them across the rocky terrain of Tatooine's Badlands, their lightsabers casting eerie shadows in the morning light. They fought among the stone arches and wind-carved formations that had witnessed countless conflicts over the millennia, adding their own chapter to the desert's long history of violence. As their battle progressed, it became clear that Obi-Wan had the advantage. His superior position on higher ground, combined with his emotional discipline and tactical awareness, gradually wore down Anakin's defenses. When Anakin made his final desperate leap, Obi-Wan was ready. His blade found its mark, severing his former apprentice's legs and leaving him burning on the edge of a lava flow that had emerged from the planet's crust. But even as Anakin writhed in agony, Padmé refused to abandon him. She couldn't love him as she once had, couldn't forgive what he had done, but she also couldn't leave him to die. The man who had destroyed a world to save her was still the father of her children, still connected to her by bonds that transcended even genocide. She used her shuttle to evacuate him to a medical facility on a nearby moon, where cybernetic specialists worked to save what remained of his life. His ruined body was encased in life-supporting armor, a mechanical shell that served as both a prison and a life preserver. The man who had destroyed a world to save one woman became a prisoner in his own mechanical body, dependent on machines for every breath. The armor was more than just life support. It was a symbol of what Anakin had become. Black and imposing, it reflected the darkness that had consumed his soul. The breathing apparatus that kept him alive produced a mechanical rhythm that seemed to echo the mechanical nature of his thoughts. He had traded his humanity for power, and the armor served as a constant reminder of that bargain. In the years that followed, the galaxy never recovered from the trauma of Coruscant's destruction. The event became known as the Great Cataclysm, a watershed moment that divided galactic history into before and after. Children learned about it in schools as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and obsessive love. Without a central authority, conflicts erupted everywhere as species and systems settled old grudges that had been suppressed by Republic law. The Hutt cartels expanded their influence, filling the power vacuum left by the collapse of Republic institutions. Pirate fleets emerged from hiding to prey on shipping lanes that were no longer protected by naval patrols. Some systems attempted to maintain order by forming regional alliances, but these efforts were hampered by mutual suspicion and competing interests. The Corellian system formed a defensive pact with its neighbors, while the corporate sector authority expanded its influence by offering protection to worlds that couldn't defend themselves. But these new governments lacked the legitimacy and resources of the old Republic, making them unstable and prone to internal conflict. The Jedi Order, already decimated by the war, was blamed by many for failing to prevent the catastrophe. Those few Jedi who survived went into hiding, their reputation forever tainted by association with Anakin's crimes. Some changed their names and abandoned their connection to the Force, while others retreated to remote worlds where they could practice their beliefs in solitude. The Separatists, led by Count Dooku, attempted to capitalize on the chaos by launching a series of conquest campaigns. But their efforts were hampered by the same instability that affected everyone else. Without a clear enemy to unite against, the Separatist alliance began to fracture as member systems pursued their own agendas. Padmé raised Luke and Leia on Alderaan, under the protection of Bail Organa and his wife, Queen Breha. The planet's peaceful culture and strong defensive capabilities made it one of the few stable havens in an increasingly chaotic galaxy. But even there, the shadow of their father's crimes followed the twins. She told them their father was dead, which was true in every way that mattered. The man who had loved her enough to destroy a world had died the moment he made that choice, replaced by something broken and terrible that wore his face. The children grew up believing that their father had been a war hero who died fighting for justice, a lie that Padmé told to protect them from a truth that might destroy them. But lies have a way of revealing themselves, and as Luke and Leia grew older, they began to ask questions that their mother couldn't answer. Why did they live on Alderaan instead of Naboo? Why were there no pictures of their father? Why did their mother sometimes look at them with such sadness, as if seeing something in their faces that caused her pain? The twins grew up in a galaxy without hope, where the very mention of Coruscant's fate served as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. They learned about the Republic from history books and their mother's stories, but to them, it seemed like a fairy tale, a golden age that had ended before they were born. The galaxy they knew was one of constant conflict, where might made right, and the strong preyed upon the weak. Luke inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and his sensitivity to the Force, though Padmé was careful to discourage his interest in the mystical energy field. She had seen what the Force could do when wielded by someone consumed by passion, and she was determined to protect her son from the same fate. But the boy's natural curiosity and innate connection to the Force made suppression difficult. Leia inherited her mother's political instincts and her father's strength of will, but her sensitivity to the Force manifested differently. Where Luke was drawn to the mystical aspects of the energy field, Leia was more attuned to its connection to living beings. She could sense emotions and intentions, making her a formidable negotiator and strategist, even as a child. As they entered their teenage years, both twins began to chafe against the limitations their mother placed on them. Luke wanted to explore the galaxy, to seek adventure among the stars, like the heroes of the stories he read. Leia wanted to enter politics, to follow in her mother's footsteps, and work to restore peace and justice to the galaxy. But Padmé was haunted by the fear that her children might repeat their father's mistakes. She had seen how good intentions could lead to monstrous actions, how love could become obsession, how the desire to protect could become the willingness to destroy. Every time she looked at her children, she saw echoes of Anakin in their faces, reminders of the man who had loved her enough to commit genocide. The twins never knew that their father lived still, trapped in his mechanical prison on a remote world in the Outer Rim. Anakin had survived his injuries, but survival was perhaps too kind a word for his existence. The life support armor that kept him alive also served as a constant reminder of what he had lost. Every breath was a mechanical rasp, every movement accompanied by the whir of servos and the hiss of hydraulics. He spent his days in meditation, using the Force to monitor events across the galaxy and to search for some sign that his sacrifice had been worthwhile. But the reports that reached him spoke only of chaos and conflict, of a galaxy tearing itself apart in the absence of central authority. The peace he had hoped to create through destruction had proven to be an illusion. Sometimes, in his darker moments, Anakin wondered if he had been wrong. Perhaps the Jedi had been right about attachment, about the need to let go of what one feared to lose. Perhaps his love for Padmé had indeed been his downfall, a weakness that had led him to commit the ultimate evil. But such thoughts were quickly suppressed, replaced by the certainty that he had done what was necessary to save the woman he loved. He never tried to contact Padmé or their children, understanding that his presence in their lives would only bring them pain. The man who had destroyed a world for love now demonstrated his love through absence, allowing his family to believe he was dead rather than forcing them to confront the monster he had become. But the Force connected all living things, and sometimes he could sense them through the vast network of energy that permeated the galaxy. He felt Padmé's sadness, her struggle to raise their children while carrying the weight of his crimes. He felt Luke's growing curiosity about his heritage and Leia's determination to make a difference in the galaxy. And in those moments, he was both proud of what they had become and horrified by the legacy he had left them. The galaxy continued to fragment as the years passed, with new conflicts erupting faster than old ones could be resolved. Trade wars escalated into shooting wars as systems fought for resources that had once been distributed equitably under Republic administration. Refugee crises developed as populations fled from violence that showed no signs of ending. Some worlds prospered in the new order, free from the regulations and taxes that had constrained them under Republic rule. But many more suffered as the services and protections provided by central government disappeared. Medical supplies became scarce on remote worlds that had depended on Republic aid programs. Educational systems collapsed as funding dried up. Infrastructure crumbled without the engineering core that had maintained it. The economic systems that had supported galactic civilization for millennia began to break down as trade routes became unsafe and currency became unstable. The Republic credit, once accepted throughout the galaxy, lost its value as confidence in the government that had backed it evaporated. Barter systems emerged in many regions, with worlds trading raw materials for manufactured goods in deals negotiated by local warlords and corporate representatives. Criminal organizations flourished in the absence of effective law enforcement. The Hutt cartels expanded their operations far beyond their traditional territories, establishing bases on worlds that could no longer defend themselves. Pirate fleets emerged from the shadows to prey on merchant vessels that were no longer protected by naval escorts. Slavery, which had been gradually eliminated under Republic law, returned to many systems as desperate populations sold themselves for survival. The clone army, which had been the Republic's primary military force, fragmented along with everything else. Some clone units remained loyal to their Jedi commanders and tried to maintain order in their assigned sectors. Others went rogue, becoming mercenaries or warlords in their own right. Many simply removed their inhibitor chips and tried to build normal lives for themselves. But their accelerated aging and military conditioning made integration into civilian society difficult. Religious movements emerged across the galaxy as people sought meaning in the chaos that surrounded them. Some proclaimed that the destruction of Coruscant was a divine judgment on a corrupt civilization, while others preached that it was the beginning of the end times. Cults formed around the figure of Anakin Skywalker, with some viewing him as a hero who had freed the galaxy, and others seeing him as a demon who had doomed it. The scientific community struggled to continue their work without the funding and coordination that had been provided by Republic institutions. Research projects that had been decades in development were abandoned as their sponsors disappeared in the chaos. Medical advances were lost as data centers were destroyed in conflicts. The great works of engineering that had connected the galaxy began to decay without maintenance. Cultural institutions suffered as well. The great libraries and museums that had preserved galactic heritage were scattered across thousands of worlds, many of which could no longer afford to maintain them. Art and literature that had celebrated the diversity and unity of galactic civilization seemed outdated in a universe where such concepts had lost their meaning. But perhaps the greatest loss was the death of hope itself. For over 1,000 years, the Republic had represented the idea that different species could work together for the common good, that conflicts could be resolved through dialogue rather than violence, that progress was possible through cooperation and understanding. The destruction of Coruscant had not just ended a government, it had killed a dream. Children who came of age after the Great Cataclysm knew only a galaxy of constant conflict and shifting alliances. They learned to survive in a universe where might made right, where loyalty was temporary, and where trust was a luxury that few could afford. The idealism that had characterized previous generations seemed naive to those who had never known peace. And yet, life continued. People fell in love, had children, built homes, and pursued dreams despite the chaos around them. Local communities formed bonds of mutual support that helped them weather the storms of galactic politics. Artists and writers continued to create, finding beauty and meaning even in the darkest of times. Teachers and healers continued their work, passing on knowledge and providing care to those who needed it. On Alderaan, Luke and Leia grew into young adults who embodied both the best hopes and the deepest fears of their generation. They had been raised with stories of the Republic's golden age, but they had also seen the cost of trying to restore it. They understood that change was necessary, but they were determined to find a path that didn't require the destruction of entire worlds. Luke had become a skilled pilot and mechanic, his natural connection to the Force giving him reflexes and intuition that made him nearly unbeatable in the cockpit. But he had also developed a deep respect for life that kept him from using his abilities for violence. He dreamed of exploring the galaxy, of finding other Force users who might help him understand his abilities. But he was held back by his mother's fears and his own sense of responsibility to his family. Leia had become a formidable politician and diplomat, her ability to sense emotions and intentions making her a masterful negotiator. She had already begun to establish contacts across the galaxy, building networks of allies who shared her vision of a more peaceful future. But she was also aware of the forces arrayed against such efforts. The warlords and criminals who profited from chaos and would resist any attempt to restore order. Neither twin knew the full truth about their father, but both had inherited his potential for both great good and great evil. They possessed the same powerful connection to the Force that had made Anakin so formidable, but they also carried the same passionate nature that had led him astray. Their mother's greatest fear was that they might repeat his mistakes, that their desire to help others might lead them down the same dark path that had consumed him. But they also carried something that their father had lost in his final moments as a Jedi: hope, despite growing up in a galaxy torn apart by conflict. Despite knowing that their very existence was tied to one of history's greatest tragedies, they believed that things could be better. They had faith that the mistakes of the past could be overcome, that the galaxy could be healed through patience and wisdom rather than force and fear. As they reached adulthood, both twins began to make their mark on the galaxy in their own ways. Luke joined a humanitarian organization that provided aid to refugee populations, using his piloting skills to deliver supplies to worlds devastated by conflict. Leia entered the political arena, working with Bail Organa to build coalitions that might eventually restore some form of galactic government. But their efforts were always overshadowed by the legacy of their father's actions. Every negotiation was complicated by the memory of Coruscant's destruction. Every humanitarian mission was viewed through the lens of suspicion and fear. The galaxy that Anakin had tried to save through destruction was now so traumatized by that destruction that it might never heal. And somewhere in the depths of space, in a fortress built on a world where the sun never shone, Anakin Skywalker continued his mechanical existence. He had achieved his goal of saving Padmé's life, had freed her from the Republic's justice, and ensured that their children could grow up without the threat of political persecution. But the cost of that victory had been higher than he had ever imagined. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that some prices are too high to pay, even for the people we love most. His victory was complete and utterly hollow, a monument to the truth that the road to hell is paved with good intentions and the absolute certainty that we are justified in our choices. In trying to prevent one death, he had caused billions. In trying to save his family, he had destroyed their future. The galaxy would never forgive him for what he had done, and perhaps more importantly, he would never forgive himself. He had become exactly what he had sworn to oppose: a bringer of darkness, a destroyer of hope, a symbol of what happened when love became obsession and protection became destruction. But forgiveness was a luxury that the galaxy could not afford to indulge. As decades passed after the great cataclysm, new generations arose who knew Coruscant's destruction only as a historical event, not a lived trauma. These young beings, born into chaos and raised in conflict, began to view Anakin Skywalker not as a monster, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked emotion and absolute power. On some worlds, his story became a teaching tool used in schools to illustrate the importance of institutional safeguards and the rule of law. Children learned about the Clone Wars, not as a glorious conflict between good and evil, but as a complex political crisis that had been manipulated by those seeking power. They studied the Republic's constitution and its failures, learning to identify the warning signs of authoritarianism and the importance of peaceful dissent. But on other worlds, particularly those that had suffered under Republic rule, Anakin's actions were viewed more sympathetically. These populations saw him as someone who had finally stood up to an oppressive system, even if his methods had been extreme. Underground movements arose that claimed to follow his example, using violence and terrorism to fight against what they saw as corrupt local governments. The Skywalker Doctrine, as it came to be known, held that any government that became tyrannical enough forfeited its right to exist, and that those with the power to destroy such governments had a moral obligation to do so. This philosophy inspired countless acts of violence across the galaxy, from assassination attempts against unpopular leaders to full-scale rebellions against established authorities. Luke and Leia found themselves at the center of these debates, whether they wanted to be or not. As they grew older and their Force abilities became more apparent, they became symbols of both hope and fear for various factions across the galaxy. Some groups saw them as the rightful heirs to their father's power, potential leaders who could unite the galaxy under a new form of government. Others viewed them as dangerous threats who might repeat their father's crimes on an even larger scale. The twins' differing approaches to their heritage created tension between them as they entered their 30s. Luke, influenced by his humanitarian work, believed that their father's greatest crime had been his willingness to use violence to solve political problems. He advocated for complete pacifism, arguing that the Force should only be used for healing and protection, never for attack. Leia, shaped by her political experiences, took a more pragmatic view. She believed that their father's mistake had not been his willingness to use force, but his refusal to work within existing systems to achieve change. She advocated for the gradual reconstruction of galactic government, using both diplomatic pressure and, when necessary, military intervention to prevent conflicts and protect the innocent. These philosophical differences came to a head during the Corellian crisis, when that system's government began implementing policies that many viewed as genocidal against non-human populations. Luke argued for a purely humanitarian response, sending aid to refugee populations, but refusing to take any action that might escalate the conflict. Leia argued for military intervention, claiming that they had a moral obligation to prevent atrocities even if it meant using force. The debate between the twins reflected a larger struggle within galactic society about how to prevent future catastrophes like Coruscant's destruction. Some systems formed mutual defense pacts, arguing that only collective security could prevent the rise of another individual with planet-destroying power. Others embraced isolationism, believing that the safest approach was to avoid entanglement in galactic politics altogether. The search for a new form of galactic governance became one of the defining issues of the post-Republic era. Political theorists proposed everything from a loose confederation of autonomous systems to a highly centralized empire with strict constitutional limits on executive power. Some argued for a return to the Republic's original structure, while others claimed that any large-scale government was inherently vulnerable to the same corruption that had doomed its predecessor. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed the Force and those who could wield it. The Jedi Order's failure to prevent the Clone Wars and their inability to stop Anakin's fall had shattered the mystique that had surrounded Force users for millennia. No longer were they seen as wise guardians who could be trusted with power. Instead, they were viewed as potentially dangerous individuals who needed to be carefully monitored and controlled. New institutions arose to study Force sensitivity and its implications for galactic society. The Institute for Force Studies on Corellia became a leading center for research into the biological and psychological factors that influenced Force ability. Their studies revealed that Force sensitivity was far more common than the Jedi had believed, but that most individuals with these abilities never developed them beyond basic intuitive feelings. The Institute's research also suggested that the Jedi's traditional training methods might actually increase the risk of a Force user falling to the dark side. By suppressing emotional attachments and teaching absolute moral codes, the Order had created psychological pressure that could lead to explosive releases of repressed feelings. Alternative training methods were developed that emphasized emotional integration rather than suppression, allowing Force users to acknowledge and process their feelings in healthy ways. Some of these new Force traditions gained widespread acceptance, particularly those that emphasized service to others and peaceful conflict resolution. The Guardians of Light, founded on Naboo, became known for their work as healers and mediators, using their abilities to help communities resolve disputes without violence. The Order of the Sacred Flame, based on Jedha, focused on spiritual development and philosophical study, seeking to understand the Force's deeper mysteries without becoming involved in politics. But other Force traditions embraced darker philosophies, arguing that Anakin Skywalker had been right to use his power decisively rather than allowing injustice to continue. The Brotherhood of Necessary Darkness recruited Force-sensitive individuals who had been victims of oppression, training them to use their abilities for revenge against those who had wronged them. The Order of Absolute Justice claimed that Force users had a moral obligation to eliminate evil wherever they found it, regardless of legal or political constraints. These competing philosophies led to conflicts that sometimes escalated into open warfare. The Force Wars, as historians would later call them, were a series of conflicts between different Force-using groups that raged across the galaxy for nearly a decade. Unlike the Clone Wars, these conflicts were fought not over political territory or economic resources, but over fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, power and responsibility, justice and mercy. The most devastating of these conflicts was the War of Three Philosophies, fought between the Guardians of Light, the Brotherhood of Necessary Darkness, and a new group called the Synthesists, who claimed to have found a middle path between light and dark. The war began when the Brotherhood launched coordinated attacks against several synthesis training centers, claiming that their teachings were corrupting young Force users with moral relativism. The conflict quickly spread as different systems chose sides based on their own political and philosophical leanings. Worlds that had suffered under authoritarian rule tended to support the Brotherhood, while those that valued stability and peaceful resolution backed the Guardians. The synthesists found support among intellectuals and academics who appreciated their nuanced approach to moral questions. The war finally ended when all three groups were confronted by an external threat: the return of the Sith, a group of dark side users who had been hiding in the unknown regions since before the Clone Wars emerged, to take advantage of the chaos, seeking to establish their own empire among the fractured systems of the former Republic. Faced with this common enemy, the Force-using groups were forced to cooperate, but the experience left lasting scars and deepened the divisions within galactic society. Throughout these conflicts, Anakin Skywalker remained in his fortress on Vyun, observing events through his network of spies and informants, but never directly intervening. He watched as his actions continued to influence galactic history decades after Coruscant's destruction, as new generations struggled with the legacy he had left them. Sometimes he was tempted to emerge from hiding, to try to guide events in a more positive direction, but he always pulled back, recognizing that his presence would only make things worse. His isolation was broken only once, when Luke and Leia, now in their 40s, finally discovered the truth about their father's survival. The revelation came through a former Imperial officer who had served on Vyun and recognized the twins during a diplomatic mission to a nearby system. Faced with the knowledge that their father was still alive, the twins were forced to confront the question of whether they should seek him out. The debate between them was agonizing. Luke argued that they owed it to themselves and to the galaxy to confront their father, to try to understand why he had made the choices he had, and perhaps to find some form of reconciliation. Leia argued that their father had forfeited any right to their consideration when he chose genocide over justice, and that seeking him out would only give legitimacy to his actions. In the end, they decided to go together, approaching Vyun, not as children seeking their father's approval, but as adults demanding accountability for his crimes. The meeting was brief and painful, with Anakin expressing regret for his actions but defending them as necessary to save Padmé's life. The twins left without offering forgiveness, but also without condemning him to continued isolation. The encounter changed all three of them in subtle ways. Anakin began to emerge from his fortress more frequently, using his abilities to help resolve conflicts in nearby systems, while carefully avoiding any action that might be seen as an attempt to seize power. Luke and Leia found themselves better able to understand the psychological pressures that could lead someone to make terrible choices, even as they remained committed to finding better solutions to the galaxy's problems. The meeting itself had taken place in a neutral location, a space station orbiting the dead world of Alderaan that had been destroyed in an unrelated conflict years earlier. The symbolism was not lost on any of them. Three members of a broken family meeting in the shadow of another destroyed world, trying to find some form of understanding amidst the ruins of their shared history. Anakin had arrived first, his distinctive black armor making him easily recognizable, even at a distance. He had aged considerably since his transformation, his movements slower and more deliberate than they had once been. The mechanical sounds of his breathing apparatus filled the small conference room, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his choices. Luke and Leia had entered together, presenting a united front despite their internal disagreements about whether this meeting was wise. They had both grown into confident adults, but in their father's presence, they seemed younger somehow, reduced to the children they had never been allowed to be. The family resemblance was unmistakable, particularly in their eyes and the stubborn set of their jaws. The conversation had been stilted and painful, full of long silences and careful words. Anakin had tried to explain his reasoning, to help them understand the desperation that had driven him to destroy Coruscant. He spoke of the visions that had shown him Padmé's death, of the Republic's corruption, of his belief that drastic action was the only way to save what he loved most. Luke had listened with the patience of someone accustomed to hearing traumatic stories, but his questions revealed the depth of his struggle to reconcile the father he had imagined with the man sitting before him. He asked about alternatives that might have been tried, about whether Anakin had truly believed that genocide was the only solution, about how he lived with the knowledge of what he had done. Leia's approach had been more direct and confrontational. She challenged his justifications, pointed out the logical flaws in his reasoning, and forced him to acknowledge the full scope of the damage his actions had caused. Her questions were harder and less forgiving than Luke's, but they also revealed a desire to understand that was perhaps more honest than her brother's gentler approach. Anakin had answered as best he could, but there were no words that could truly explain or justify what he had done. He spoke of his love for their mother, of his fear of loss, of the way the dark side had whispered promises of power and solutions. But even as he spoke, he could see in their eyes that no explanation would ever be sufficient. The meeting had ended without resolution, without forgiveness, and without the reconciliation that some part of Anakin had hoped for. Luke and Leia had left as they had come, together and determined to forge their own path forward. But something had changed in all of them, a shift in understanding that would influence their actions for years to come. After the meeting, Anakin's behavior began to change in subtle but significant ways. He started venturing out from his fortress on Vyun, traveling to nearby systems where conflicts threatened to escalate into violence. He never revealed his identity, wearing a modified version of his armor that concealed his distinctive breathing apparatus and distorted his voice. Instead, he worked through intermediaries and anonymous channels, using his understanding of political manipulation and his force abilities to diffuse tensions before they could explode into warfare. His first intervention had been on the world of Malastare, where two rival mining consortiums were preparing for open warfare over access to fuel deposits. Anakin had used his technical expertise to identify alternative fuel sources that both sides could exploit without coming into conflict, then anonymously provided this information to neutral mediators who could present it as their own discovery. The success of this intervention led to others. On Sullust, he helped prevent a labor uprising by anonymously funding safety improvements in the mines that addressed workers' grievances. On Bothawi, he used his network of informants to expose corruption in the planetary government, leading to reforms that reduced tensions between different ethnic groups. But even these positive actions were complicated by his past. When word spread that someone with unusual knowledge and resources was working to prevent conflicts in the Outer Rim, various factions began trying to identify and recruit this mysterious benefactor. Some suspected that it might be a surviving Jedi, while others wondered if it could be a reformed Imperial agent or a wealthy philanthropist. The speculation made Anakin's work more difficult and dangerous. He had to constantly change his methods and routes to avoid detection. And he lived in constant fear that his identity would be discovered and his interventions would be discredited by association with his crimes. The irony was not lost on him that his efforts to atone for his past were hindered by the very reputation that made atonement necessary. Meanwhile, Luke and Leia continued their own work, but their encounter with their father had changed their perspectives in important ways. Luke became more aware of the dangers of emotional attachment and the ways that love could be twisted into justification for terrible acts. He began incorporating these insights into his humanitarian work, helping other Force-sensitive individuals understand and manage their emotions in healthy ways. His work with traumatized Force users became one of his most important contributions to the post-Republic galaxy. Many beings with Force sensitivity had been caught up in the various conflicts that followed Coruscant's destruction, and their abilities had often been corrupted by exposure to violence and trauma. Luke developed new training methods that emphasized emotional healing alongside Force development, helping these individuals learn to use their abilities for construction rather than destruction. One of his most challenging cases involved a young human named Jax Pavan, whose Force abilities had manifested during the destruction of his homeworld by Imperial remnant forces. Jax had used his powers to fight back against the attackers, but the experience had left him consumed by rage and a desire for revenge. When Luke first encountered him, Jax was leading a group of vigilantes who hunted down former Imperial officers and executed them without trial. Luke's approach to helping Jax was patient and methodical. Instead of immediately condemning the young man's actions, he worked to understand the trauma that had driven them. He learned about Jax's family, who had been killed in the Imperial attack, and about the helplessness he had felt while watching his world burn. Only after establishing this understanding did Luke begin to help Jax find healthier ways to channel his grief and anger. The process took months, during which Luke had to constantly balance support with accountability. He helped Jax understand that his desire for justice was legitimate, but that his methods were perpetuating the cycle of violence that had already claimed so many lives. Gradually, Jax began to redirect his energy toward helping other survivors of Imperial attacks, using his Force abilities to aid in rescue and reconstruction efforts rather than seeking revenge. Leia's work also evolved after her encounter with their father. She became more focused on building institutional safeguards that could prevent the concentration of power that had enabled Palpatine's rise and her father's fall. Her diplomatic efforts began to emphasize constitutional frameworks and checks and balances rather than simply resolving immediate conflicts. One of her most significant achievements was the creation of the Galactic Monitoring Consortium, an organization that tracked the development of weapons of mass destruction and political movements that might threaten planetary populations. The consortium was deliberately designed to be decentralized and democratic, with representatives from dozens of systems working together to identify and address potential threats before they could become catastrophic. The consortium's first major test came when intelligence reports suggested that a group of Imperial scientists were working to develop a new type of planet-killing weapon on the remote world of Biss. The situation was complicated by the fact that Biss was technically independent and had not requested outside intervention, but the potential consequences of allowing the weapon's development to continue were too severe to ignore. Leia led a diplomatic mission to Biss that combined negotiation with covert intelligence gathering. She worked openly with the planet's government to address their security concerns while secretly coordinating with agents who were documenting the weapons program. The mission was dangerous and required her to use her Force abilities more aggressively than she was comfortable with, probing the minds of government officials to determine their level of involvement with the weapons project. The breakthrough came when Leia discovered that most of the planetary government was unaware of the weapons program, which was being conducted by a small group of Imperial loyalists who had infiltrated the planet's research institutions. By exposing this conspiracy to the legitimate government, she was able to facilitate the program's shutdown while preserving Biss's sovereignty and independence. As the century drew to a close, the galaxy had settled into a new equilibrium that was very different from the Republic that had preceded it. Instead of a single galactic government, there were dozens of regional powers that maintained their independence while cooperating on issues of mutual concern. Trade flowed along. Established routes protected by merchant guilds and local defense forces. Conflicts still arose, but they were generally contained to single systems or small regions rather than engulfing the entire galaxy. The new political structures that emerged were characterized by their emphasis on decentralization and accountability. Most regional governments operated under constitutions that included strict term limits for leaders, mandatory transparency requirements for government operations, and strong protections for individual rights and minority groups. Many also included specific provisions designed to prevent the kind of emergency powers that had enabled Palpatine's transformation of the Republic into an authoritarian state. The Force-using traditions that had emerged after the Jedi Order's fall had evolved into a complex ecosystem of competing and cooperating philosophies. Some groups maintained the old Jedi ideals of selfless service, while others embraced more individualistic approaches to power and responsibility. Most had learned to work within existing political structures rather than trying to impose their will on others. The new Jedi Covenant, founded by Luke and several other Force users who had been trained after the Republic's fall, became one of the most influential of these new traditions. Unlike the old Jedi Order, the Covenant did not require its members to abandon emotional attachments or avoid political involvement. Instead, it emphasized the importance of understanding and managing emotions while using Force abilities to serve the common good. The Covenant's training methods incorporated lessons learned from the Old Order's failures. Students were taught to recognize the warning signs of dark side corruption, to seek help when struggling with difficult emotions, and to question authority rather than blindly following orders. They were also required to spend time working in non-Force-using communities, learning to understand and respect the perspectives of those who did not share their abilities. Luke and Leia, now elderly, had become respected figures in this new galactic order. Luke's humanitarian organization had grown into a galaxy-spanning network that provided aid and disaster relief to systems in need. Leia's diplomatic efforts had resulted in the creation of several successful regional alliances that had prevented conflicts and promoted economic cooperation. But both twins remained haunted by their father's legacy and the knowledge that the galaxy's current stability was built on the ashes of billions of innocents. They had dedicated their lives to proving that there were better ways to create change than through destruction. But they could never escape the shadow of Coruscant's fate. Their children and grandchildren, growing up in this more stable but still fragmented galaxy, represented a new generation that was further removed from the trauma of the Great Cataclysm. These young beings were more optimistic about the possibility of eventually reuniting the galaxy under a common government, but they were also more aware of the dangers posed by concentrating too much power in any single institution or individual. Ben Skywalker, Luke's son, had become a prominent advocate for galactic reunification, arguing that the decentralized system that had emerged after the Republic's fall was inadequate to address threats that crossed regional boundaries. He pointed to the ongoing problem of interstellar crime syndicates, the difficulty of coordinating responses to natural disasters that affected multiple systems, and the inefficiency of maintaining dozens of separate defense forces. But Jaina Solo, Leia's daughter, took a more cautious approach. She argued that any attempt to recreate galactic government would need to proceed very slowly and with extensive safeguards against authoritarian takeover. She pointed to her grandfather's crimes as evidence of what could happen when individuals were given too much power, and she advocated for maintaining the current system while gradually improving coordination between existing regional authorities. The debate between these two approaches became one of the defining political issues of their generation. Public opinion was divided, with some systems eager to participate in a new galactic government, while others remained committed to independence. The discussion was complicated by the fact that any new government would need to address the question of what to do about Anakin Skywalker, who remained alive and represented both a potential resource and a continuing threat. Some historians argued that Anakin Skywalker's actions, horrible as they were, had ultimately been necessary to break the cycle of corruption and stagnation that had plagued the Republic. They pointed to the new political structures that had emerged, the safeguards against authoritarian rule, and the greater awareness of the need for transparency and accountability in government. But these arguments were always controversial, seen by many as attempts to justify genocide for political convenience. Others argued that the galaxy's current state, while stable, represented a tragic step backward from the unity and cooperation that had characterized the Republic at its best. They pointed to the numerous small conflicts that still erupted regularly, the persistence of slavery and oppression on many worlds, and the loss of the shared cultural identity that had bound different species together for over a millennium. The philosophical debates about Anakin's legacy extended beyond politics into religion, ethics, and psychology. Scholars studied his life and choices, trying to understand what factors had led a seemingly heroic individual to commit such horrific acts. Their conclusions varied widely, with some emphasizing the role of childhood trauma and others focusing on the corrupting influence of power or the dangers of emotional attachment. These academic discussions had practical implications for how societies structured their institutions and raised their children. Educational systems incorporated lessons about emotional regulation and the importance of seeking help when dealing with difficult feelings. Political systems included safeguards designed to prevent the concentration of power and the emergence of authoritarian leaders. Mental health services expanded to address the ongoing trauma that continued to affect many beings across the galaxy. As Anakin Skywalker entered his final years, sustained by increasingly sophisticated medical technology, he continued to grapple with the consequences of his choices. He had saved Padmé's life and ensured that their children could grow up free from political persecution. But the cost had been the destruction of everything he had once sworn to protect. He had achieved his personal goals at the expense of his larger ideals, and no amount of subsequent good works could balance that cosmic equation. The man who had once been the chosen one, destined to bring balance to the Force had instead brought chaos that had taken decades to resolve. His story became a permanent part of galactic history, a reminder of what could happen when individual desires were placed above collective needs, when emotion was allowed to override reason, when the means were forgotten in pursuit of the ends. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not the destruction he had caused, but the wisdom that had emerged from studying his failures. The galaxy that rose from the ashes of the Republic was more aware of its own fragility, more committed to preventing the concentration of power, and more dedicated to addressing the root causes of conflict before they could explode into violence. In the end, Anakin Skywalker's legacy was not the destruction of Coruscant or the fall of the Republic, but the hard-won wisdom that came from witnessing the consequences of his actions. The galaxy that emerged from the ashes of his choices was more cautious, more aware of its own fragility, and more committed to preventing any individual from ever again wielding the power to destroy civilizations. It was a lesson written in the blood of billions, but it was a lesson that was finally learned. That's our theory. The Star Wars universe is a galaxy filled with exciting stories and possibilities, and we love exploring them. If you want to accompany us on this journey to a galaxy far, far away, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel.